Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I'm joined by my father, Dr. Sky Keith, and by Dr. Adam Francisco as we continue to ask these why you should questions on our episodes. We want to thank everybody who joined us with our podcast celebration last week. That was very successful. We got a lot of amazing reoccurring gifts lined up for the year for the podcast network, and so a big thank you to those of you. We had some really large reoccurring gifts. So we have some people who really love the podcast network and sent us some messages or set that up, and that's amazing. If you would still like to capitalize on that celebration, you can still follow that link. It's going to stay live for a couple more days, and you can follow the link in the show notes to 1517.org/celebrate, and there you can set up a reoccurring monthly donation to support our podcasts. Okay, guys, we gave theology its time in the sun. We did a why you should know your theology, or why you should have a theology, and then we did a little law and gospel one after that to do something explicitly theological. Then we gave philosophy its time in the sun. We had Dan Dean on to do
two shows.
We turned into 2 episodes on philosophy. One, which was why you should study philosophy, which I think was really good. And then we did a second expanded one, and I ended up naming that why you should read a little more philosophy.
Oh, instead of analytic.
Well, because it ended up being mostly about Kant and
Did you do that episode when I was out with the Rona?
Yeah, you were supposed to be there, but you bailed out at the last minute.
Well, I kind of had a thing.
We made it work, and Dan did a great job.
Dan did a very good job. He'd been on the show in the past and wasn't quite as good on the mic as he was this time around.
No, yeah, he killed it. Yeah. So I think we should definitely have him back on to do
I
some
do
more.
Too. He was very good.
Was he powerful enough to change my opinion about philosophy?
It was good. Yeah, awesome. You should listen to him. They were actually he made some very good points. He did a very good sort of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle introduction, and then when we got into the sort of later stuff, it was just very good. Yeah,
nice.
I'd say you can tell that he's been, pretty much teaching that sort of intro survey to philosophy now for a decade, and it's just organic to him, and he's just seasoned at it. It was very good.
Yeah, so those were an excellent set of shows. And so now today, I think we're going to allow Adam to have history's time in the sun again, and you can welcome back from your 2-week hiatus.
Hopefully it'll be as good as Adam on
from
Islam.
The show. And I think we're going to do why you should study history like we did why you should study philosophy. And, I can just imagine that there's a big rabbit hole with this, just like philosophy, because, studying history, you can go back really, really far, or you could go back, just right before your own lifetime. And
everything that happened before you.
Everything that happened before you. And so
that's deep, man.
Why should you study it? What I actually think the other thing would be what constitutes study is like watching the History Channel World War II documentaries over and over again, studying history.
That is studying history.
The World War II, the History Channel, professional historians like to call that the Nazi Channel, or did.
Have you ever been on History
all
Channel?
They run is Nazi documentaries until they changed to like the ancient aliens and
History Channel might not be a good example anymore.
Yeah, so.
I love it. Like those are helpful when they try to like call Pawn Stars studying history because they're like looking at things made in the 20s.
Yeah. So,
but you do make a good distinction, or you raise a good question about what constitutes the study of history, and like because you I think your dad and I have not complained, because we don't complain, but have mentioned a couple times how we usually get the topic about 2 minutes before we get on the show. Before we hit record.
As in today when I texted you 90 seconds before we started?
Yeah, it was about 10 minutes before, maybe 5. And you'd think that'd be a very easy question for me to answer. But I would sure
hope so.
I'm a little anxious about it because...
That's funny. Dan
I
Dean,
take
when
it for granted.
he called me the day before. He's like, "So what are we doing? What do I need to prep for?" And I said,
No prep.
Please don't prep."
No prep. I think the lack of prep keeps the show risky enough that, like the listener can tell if we make a mistake or if we're out of our league, right? I mean, with enough prep, anybody could fake expertise in any subject. If I don't let you prep, we can find the real Adam.
Yeah, let's find the real Adam.
Yeah. The grin on your face over Zoom is a little weird. But let me just throw one more extra thing out there. Dan Van Voris and his Church History Almanac, which is the daily podcast.
Christian History Almanac.
Christian History Almanac. 5 minutes, I believe, 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah.
He's now doing, I think he calls them weekend reports. He's just started doing this, and we actually had a pretty lengthy conversation on, he was trying to find or understand the real Adam, but then we talked about, he had some questions from Vanity Fair.
Okay.
And the funny thing is, it didn't surprise me that he reads Vanity Fair, but then we started talking about church history, and so it got into this question: what's so interesting about church history? Why study it? How do you study it? And so on and so forth.
So you just did this. You should be great.
Well, the quick answer to your question: why should you study history? And kind of the snarky responses would be something like, well, how else will you know who you are? But you individually or singular, or you in plural, you as a church, you as a nation, you as a family or whatever. I mean, you just can't get around some need to know history. Now, the word study, why should you study history? I don't know. I wouldn't. And it's not because I don't want competitors, but I wouldn't recommend people, unless they're really into it, fork over tens of thousands of dollars and study history the way somebody who's studying history for a degree would study it. But I would rather phrase the question or make the statement: you should know history. Now, what do I mean by history? You should certainly know your history. If you're a member, well, I'm presuming most, if not all, of our listeners are members of a church body or some sort of Christian confession. You should be aware of the history of your denomination, because that's how you get to know who you're a part of.
I mean, we've seen some things over the years. I think this happens every once in a while online, especially in the realm they like to call Christian Twitter, right? Where somebody will
Christian Twitter.
Yeah, it's got its own name.
There's a
right?
Lutheran Twitter, right, Caleb? I don't know what it is, but I've heard Caleb refer to it before.
And
A Lutheran Twitter.
I think what you find is occasionally you'll see somebody who doesn't know the history of their denomination. Something will get exposed about it, and it's very scandalous and shocking, and sometimes causes people to jump ship by finding out that so-and-so did X, or that the founder of so-and-so denomination, like this happens with Southern Baptist stuff all the time. It's like the founder of this church was a racist. You're like, okay, so, that's...
Or one of the founders of the Missouri Synod, not Walther, but do you know the story of Stephan? Martin Stephan?
Yeah, he got sent over the river.
He was at least a womanizer, if not,
Yeah. It's hard to know, I guess.
Hard to know exactly the age of the ladies that he was cavorting with.
But the thing is, the more you study history, the more, like we talked about in our show, I think it was something entitled Low Anthropology, why you should have a low anthropology.
Yeah.
The more you learn about people around you, but people in the past, the more you'll realize you should not have too many, if at all, heroes. Because people are basically, you're big heroes in the past. You look close enough, they got some, there's a side
problems.
to them.
Yeah.
At least you shouldn't worship your heroes.
Yes.
I actually kind of find it sad that in modern movies, postmodernism has taken over so much that they're almost all anti-hero, even for people that were, or characters that were inspirational hero-like. And I don't mind them showing in the movie some flaws to the hero, right? But I can't stand it when they absolutely destroy every hero. Because I do think, at least, in the civil realm, in this civil life, it's hard to want to be a better person if you have no sort of aspirational figures to show you the way. But I think having a low anthropology will tell you to always sort of check that.
Yeah, not be surprised when you find something naughty.
Yes.
I also think it would help you. So, like in the case of a church, like knowing in our own case the history of the Missouri Synod would also help you move forward if somebody brings that up as for some reason why your particular denomination or group is more corrupt and why it still is, right?
Well,
Knowing history could tell you that you know the difference between then and now, or the events that occur afterwards to address that. If you don't know that, you don't know if any of those things were addressed by other leaders, later followers, or if your own church, does my own pastor know about this? Do we know how to deal with that kind of thing? Whereas if you're aware of that stuff, you're probably also aware of the solutions or the lack thereof or the way forward in a way that you're not if you're just sort of oblivious to what's happened.
Yeah, there's that I don't know how old of an adage it is, but those who don't know their past or don't know history
are doomed to repeat it.
And I think we all kind of know that. It is a cliche. I think I don't know where I read this, and I don't think I'm the one coining this term, but studying or knowing history certainly will help you escape the parochialism of the present. Or to put it in like C.S. Lewis's terms, you'll learn not to be a chronological snob, because you'll see in the past, while the past was different than the present, sometimes in the past people were nobler, or civilizations in the past were actually quite advanced. There were actually all civilizations, minus contemporary American civilization, all civilization recognize that there are two genders. These sorts of things that are very different now. Just a quick study of the past will make you aware that people have thought differently about things, sometimes a little in more sophisticated ways, sometimes in not so sophisticated ways. You'll learn. We've picked on over the course of how many years we've been doing this show? 4, 5 years?
No, 7.
Oh, 7. Good heavens. That's so surprising to me. We've picked on people like Thomas Aquinas quite a bit, but and rightfully so. But the more you study these people in the past, the more you will be, though you might disagree with all sorts of things, the more you'll be impressed with just how productive they might be, or how comprehensive their thinking might be. You think of, Scott, I know you've studied John Calvin quite a bit. One of the things that amazes me about Calvin is you're really hard-pressed to find, even though he wrote, I believe, a commentary on every single book of the Bible. Is that right? I know he wrote a ton of commentaries, but and in the institutes and everything else, he does not repeat himself.
No, that's
he is
interesting.
so economical in what he talks about.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's darn impressive. Whereas you read Luther.
Well, he didn't have an iPhone, so.
Yeah, Luther likes to repeat himself, but I mean, his ideas were just right. So.
Sure.
No, just kidding.
So there's just maybe that there's just these great examples. I say all this to say, studying, even if it's superficial, a little more than superficial, will help humble you a bit.
I want to ask you, sort of maybe challenge you about, because I think what you were referring to originally is, I'm not sure, like speaking for you, even though you're right there, say that you said something like, I'm not sure I would say go study history in college, or do a master's in history, or a PhD in history.
I would say study history. You bet. If you don't study history in college, I think you've been gypped.
No, I mean as a major, unless you think you can. So I want to challenge you on that just a bit, because I think that the presupposition there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's very difficult to make a living doing that.
I think so. What I meant by that is, we certainly need specialists in history, people who hold other historians accountable to make sure the record's correct, and so on and so forth. But if you go study history at the university these days, it is so specialized, or it's been just completely taken over by some very strange assumptions about history.
Like deconstructing it, right?
Yeah, so that's all. It's more of a practical thing.
I gotcha.
I mean, if you want to go be a historian, go for it. But you should go in with eyes wide open about what's going on in the profession of the historian. It's very rare these days that you might go somewhere and study history the way you and I might think you ought to study history, because it's so now. I mean, it's not this. This is not hyperbole. If you're going to go, if any university, with some very rare exceptions, if you're going to go and study history, chances are you're not going to be looking at those major events and persons from the past. You're going to be looking at gender history. You're going to be looking at those things that are hot topics, very trendy topics.
Oh my God, that's not history.
Well, true. Well,
I mean, I'm sure you could do the history of.
Well, it's the same thing.
Ideology.
It's the same thing that's happened in like systematic theology, which is to say like there's something that's been suppressed by the dominant group for 2,000 years, and now in our sort of like progressive freedom. Yep, we should go uncover those suppressed things. So we should go, like I saw while I was at Nottingham, I saw some paper or something on like the homosexuality of the early church, right? And finding like lesbian nuns or something.
This drives me crazy. And I'll tell you why it drives me crazy. Because if you study some history, right, you're never going to come to the conclusion that homosexuality was invented in 1963. Like this isn't,
right.
And I think this is the accusation of the sort of homosexual LGBT
QIA plus.
Thanks, gee, many Christmas lobby against the Christian community is that, when they try to make a historical argument, that we guys think this just popped up yesterday and it's been around forever. And at the same time, everyone's like, well, yeah, duh. I mean,
it's in Romans, so it's had to be around forever.
But I've heard of people that have like a great Uncle George that used to like to wear dresses and, stuff like that. But we would acknowledge, of course, that homosexuality specifically has always been a sinful anomaly, right? Or a sin, an action that people participated in, a sinful action that people participated in throughout history.
I mean, the Old Testament puts it pretty old as a societal norm, right? With Sodom and Gomorrah, it's like there was a whole society.
Old. So it's just silly to say that. It doesn't. It's this idea that it can't be wrong if it happened before. I'm like, well, war,
pestilence,
murder. I would call all of these things theft. I would call all of these things still wrong, even though they've happened pretty much since day one.
Or like various genocides and
But here's the thing is, sort of like with the use of the putting of pronouns down in when your email is signature. I don't know if you guys have seen this. Have you?
Yeah, I've seen it. I mean,
it's pretty much everywhere now in higher ed.
Right.
So,
like at the Concordias?
No, not at the Concordias. I mean, I'm sure a little bit of that goes on, but it's not normal by any stretch of the imagination.
I've heard it's becoming more normal even at the Concordias.
Probably for individual faculty to choose to do so.
And best construction, that's because it's so normal in the broader discipline. So if you go to the American Historical Society's annual conference.
Oh, well, I did it at a student affairs conference 8 years ago.
Oh, they were doing it back then? Wow.
So picked up a name tag that was, I was supposed to, it literally had like...
Put your pronoun.
You could pick the magnet. So it was like a thin metal name tag and it had your name on it. And then you got this little magnet thing that were your pronouns. Because, student affairs have to be silly in some way.
8 years ago. That's fascinating.
Well, maybe more. So that was like, what year is it? That was 2012, 10 years ago.
Wow. Yeah.
But of course, that stuff makes its way in, not just through the faculty at colleges. It does make its way in through sort of like the staff on the edges that are typically also very liberal.
Yeah. Well, and besides that, like you said, it's like if you go to let's say you go to 3 conferences a year where that's normal or required in some cases, you might just subconsciously start to bring that back with you. Like, what if you are sending emails to other universities, right? To other places that do use it? You expose something about yourself if you're not doing it. So sometimes safer to not expose your political opinions or whatever it may be.
Yep. Yep. Kate, can I know I'm the one who opened up this hole.
Can of worms, yeah.
Yeah, or can of worms. I was thinking rabbit hole, but another reason to study history is, especially in the case of the history of Christianity, the more you know, the less you'll be surprised by sensationalist nonsense out there.
Oh, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I'm always surprised when people are surprised.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not just talking about like immorality or things like that, but I think of
doctrinal variations and
the history.
fights.
I mean, not that everybody wants to go and study the textual history of the New Testament, but
that's what drives me crazy the most about, even in our circles, the argument over the third use of the law. It's not that I find it hard to believe that there's a good argument that might be had over it, that should continue to be had, whatever. It's just when people start barking at you about it and they have no sense of the history of it, they talk about it like it's an ancient doctrine that made its way into the Athanasian Creed or something like that, and it's just not. It's got sort of
There's a date on it.
Historical marker from sort of mid-Reformation, where it first sort of started being used and was systematized by somebody, and that doesn't make it right or wrong. It just, if you know that, though, it's helpful that you're not talking about sort of like an ancient formulation here that was acknowledged by the Reformation and sort of continued forward because the church had veered away from it. It was literally thought up as a way to communicate how God's law, or how God uses the law, was thought up at a particular time in the Lutheran Reformation. Now, again, that doesn't make it right or wrong or whatever, but it's an interesting point if you know it.
Well, and it's interesting then to look at its reception. Did it cause controversy at that time? Did any other Christians use it? Is there a difference between, say, the Lutheran systematizing of it and Calvin's systematizing of it?
You can even get from that, if you study the history of knowing why we accuse people of being antinomians if they don't believe in it, and what was the actual antinomian controversy, and what is an actual antinomian.
Yeah, so you could, and you can do that without sort of, just dealing with the people now, but actually finding the rooted categories.
You can study the history of the thing.
Is what happens with stuff like justification in the Reformation, right? It's like,
otherwise,
is this what the term actually is used
like
for?
Making stuff up? Like, hey, I'm the first person that thought of this. And you're like, I'm not sure that's even possible.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Can I add one more thing? I mean, there's probably more I could add, but this is more of a theological point about knowing history. So if God decided he was going to take on human flesh and enter time and space.
This is a big one.
Mm-hmm. Not if, he did, right? That suggests there's something meaningful to it. And I think I encountered this first in Justin. Of course, you could argue it's New Testament, it's John, Gospel of John, but Justin Martyr makes a point. He's a second, dies. I think we celebrated his feast day not too long ago. Well, somebody celebrated his feast day, but dies like 160, I think. He's martyred. He says something like, when the infinite comes into the finite world, it floods the whole world with meaning.
Oh,
now he went kind of went to the extreme on that, in that, like, he says, look at ships, sailing ships. I wish our
mast.
I was going to say, I wish our sainted old pastor was here that used the nautical terms, but I should know him too. But the mast and the crossbeam, look, it's in the shape of the cross. This is yet another sign of the truthfulness of Christianity. So he goes a little extreme on it, but I think there's a point there. If God thinks that humans and their history is so important, he loves it so much that he's willing to demean himself and enter into it. That suggests it's important. And I would say in our day and age, when everybody's thinking about the future, which doesn't exist, so everybody's thinking and planning for something that does not exist, you're wasting your time.
Or thinking they can accurately prophesy it, right? So I was just listening to a podcast the other day where was not about theology or history or politics or anything. It was literally about mountain biking. And this guy, all of a sudden goes off on this tangent, and he goes, with the certain impending planet-wide collapse of the environment. And I'm like, and he goes, in the next 50 years. I'm like, wow, that's really freaking specific prophecy right there. That's like the dudes that are like, Christ is going to come again on April 23rd, 2031. Get your butt ready. I'm like, this is the same thing for a future that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah. But what does and has existed is the present right now and everything before then. And if you're like in terms of like business and marketing, there's no better place to do research than the historical trends.
Yeah.
Rather than if you're just thinking about what's going to happen.
Everybody's retirement in the United States is based off of the idea that historically, certain index funds that we all put our 401k, or if you're us, 403b.
I need you to look at mine, by the way.
I'm gonna have to
go
call
up
you too.
even when they go down. Over time they go up. That's a historical trend. Without that historical trend, our financial system doesn't operate, right?
Even though in every commercial they say past performance is not indicative of future results.
Yes, well, that's about specific investments, I would suppose. But I mean, our financial system in the United States banks on the fact that historically certain things happen, trends happen.
Yeah. If you want to get out, I know we still have a bit of time, but if you want to get out of your own little echo chamber, I know Scott loves that word, echo chamber. If you want to get out of your echo chamber, your parochial little world, your neighborhood, if you have the itch to travel but you can't, the best way to do it is just simply take a look at the past. There's a novel, I forget the name of it now, but it starts off with the line, the past is a different country. They do things differently there.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that.
So, you can certainly travel and get all sorts of great experience, but let's say you can't. Let's say there's a pandemic, or let's say you just don't have the funds to do it. The next best way to get a global education is just simply to read about different places and different periods in history. And you'll find a lot of people are turned off by history because they sat through maybe American History 2 in high school. This was my experience, where the wrestling coach was the teacher. God bless wrestling coaches, but maybe aren't the best historians. This guy certainly wasn't. I won't mention his name. He's probably dead.
They do end up teaching history a lot, though.
They do, and this guy, and I hated history in high school because all we did was talk about the Vietnam War. And every
that was his
month,
history.
and maybe he was a veteran. I don't know, but give history a second chance. Pop open a pop level history text, or watch a documentary that's not pushing a political agenda, and you probably, if you're a curious person, be mesmerized by just how fascinating things can be. So I'm gonna maybe kind of. We still have about 10 minutes, but I'm going to say that ultimately awareness and study of history will make you a better person, relatively speaking. Not better in the eyes of God, but
well-rounded sort of way. Yeah. I think we kind of went over it past and got to Justin Martyr pretty quick, but I think the idea that if Christ really did enter into, so if the Word made flesh really did enter into real history, that by itself makes it an important thing to be aware of.
Absolutely.
I mean, even understanding, the idea of in the fullness of time, and sort of you can get some sense of what was going on at the time, and sort of advantages of the Roman Empire that allowed the gospel to be spread in a way that it probably couldn't have spread prior to that. And it's just very interesting stuff. I mean, just very, very interesting. The genealogies, Chad Bird always says, don't pass over the genealogies because that's where the magic is, even though they seem boring. But the genealogies tell you that every genealogy in the Bible tells you the history of the Messiah.
Yeah.
Well, and sort of that the past of God's people to the Messiah was about genealogies, and that the future is also wrapped up in genealogies. This thing doesn't
Yeah.
keep going unless you have a generation to pass things on to.
I think, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, like an understanding of history and how important it was in the past to sort of have children and pass that on, and to pass, that your own, even if you're a secularist and not a believer, your only legacy after you die is your progeny. And having an understanding of that. I mean, I think we're sorely lacking that. I mean, even the United States is, which held out for a while, is entering like an emergency zone now when it comes to the rate of fertility.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, it's true. I think that gives you a reason to study history. It also gives you, like, not everybody's going to be famous and have their whole life and everything they do documented and shared with the world. But if you raise a family who cares about you and is invested in each other, something about your life will likely live on beyond you. Then too, something about who you were will be documented and preserved in that. And
Yeah. Let me say, for the Christian in particular too, when Christianity, we say this quite a bit here in some way, shape, or form. Christianity is a historical religion, and for us, the gospel is not just some abstract concept. We trust that certain historical events not just took place, but took place on our behalf.
That's right.
He was crucified for our sins and rose for our justification. So while there's more to it than just historical events, it's contingent, it's truthfulness that it actually is. Gospel does give comfort, is contingent upon whether these events actually took place. So the more you study, say, the history, New Testament history, or the life of Jesus, you're not saving yourself any more than you already are saved through the shed blood of Jesus, but you're, in a way, growing in your faith. So I think among the various religions, there are some exceptions, but by and large, Christianity is the one religion out there that is absolutely wedded to history and historical events.
Yeah, in a way that other religions, just because they have historical figures as a part of it, or even sort of the prophet or whatever the great teacher, are not. Literally, if our history is untrue, we claim that the whole thing is useless.
Yeah, and imagine going to a cocktail party. That'd be delightful. I haven't been to a cocktail party.
This sounds like a Rod Rosenblatt kind of thing to say. I like it.
Well, after a day of lounging in the grass with Francis Schaeffer at La Brie, then you attend a cocktail party.
You put your tuxedo on and go to the cocktail party.
But imagine going to a cocktail party and talking with people, none of whom know any sort of history. What are you going to talk about? Baseball? Yeah, that'd be interesting for about 2 minutes. I mean,
the
if
last
you want to be an interesting person,
party I was at with you and Paul talked about jiu-jitsu for about an hour and a half, which I lasted about 3 minutes on.
See, you weren't interested because we were only interested in our parochial thing. But what binds us all together is we have some sort of common history. Even though you're too wimpy to get on the mats, there is something that binds us.
Wow.
It's our historical experience. I was actually thinking earlier, man, I wish jiu-jitsu wasn't so popular there in California, because then I could probably convince Scott to do it, but since you're not a joiner, you won't do it.
It's still a joining thing.
There's something interesting about that. History maybe even affects the limited scope of people you'll meet or will be friends with. I was thinking about this the other day. I had a friend who came up to Big Bear. He's a Lutheran pastor. His wife and kid were up here, and the thing that Eric and I and his wife all have in common, the reason we've met each other, the reason I met and married my wife, the reason he met and married his wife, that singular link is Lutheranism. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the one thing all of our lives had in common. My wife grew up on the East Coast. Everybody else grew up in different parts of the country or neighborhoods or whatever. But the one link you have is this one historical denomination. Without that, these people would never have met.
And even though we sort of bag on the individual denominations, it's often the institutions of the denominations that brought you together.
Correct.
So
CUI,
in the case
or
of your
camps.
friend and his wife, it was the university. For you, it was the camps. For me, it was the camps. Those were / are denominational institutions.
Correct.
Yeah, since we have a little bit of time, can I add one more thing that's useful about history?
Oh, please do. We were waiting for it.
Oh, I feel like I'm being mocked a little bit, but
No.
a real practical aspect of history, especially in our supercharged political world that oftentimes points to history or has a particular interpretation of history to back up certain things, is how else are you going to navigate a world that says all of American history, for example, should be told through the lens of that awful institution of slavery? Here I'm thinking like 1619 Project and the assumption that goes into that.
Or that you're not allowed
history.
to mention certain names because they were bad people.
Yeah. Or how else are you going to answer? Let's say you're at Costco and Bart Ehrman publishes his most recent book on the Gospels, and he makes
it to. I don't go to Costco. His books make it to Costco.
Yeah, well, Sam's Club, and I've seen him at Costco, I believe.
Wow, you go to
Misquoting
Costco.
Jesus was at, hundreds of them at Sam's Club years and years ago. But, he makes the usual claim that there's no reason to believe the doctrine of the deity of Jesus because it didn't make its way into the Christian church until the 4th century. Like, how else are you going to respond to that historical claim if you don't know your own history?
Right.
So, there's a whole lot of just practical utility in navigating both our political and social world, as well as the religious world, the world of the marketplace of ideas. Let's just put it that way.
For that same reason, there's probably a good case to not just know some history, but to know historical methodology too, right? So you could identify good and bad ones. I saw the other day. It was I think it was a YouTube video. It was something like, it wasn't Bart Ehrman, but it was other ones, and it had to do with these fringe Christian historians who discovered that the Gospels are not the true Christianity, and that the real Gnostic Gospels really got suppressed, and the information is all secret, and institutions kept it down. You could actually buy, and this guy was suggesting the books you should buy to find the real history of Christianity, right? If you knew historical methodology, the book isn't something as terrifying to read anymore, right? Because you could determine if the work put into producing a book about the secret history of Christianity is actually historical,
It's actually secret.
or if it's just some crazy person speculating.
It's not, man. But if anytime you write that book, it's going to sell more than any book I'd write. Because you're saying, here's the secret history of the secret.
Yeah.
Yep.
Literally, if you say, here's the secret history of the Gnostic Gospels, you're literally saying,
Well, of Christianity is what this stuff was.
That's an outstanding point. Think of, I know, Scott, you remember, but Caleb, maybe you were too young. Do you remember the book, and then it turned into a movie with, who starred in it? He was in Big. Tom Hanks?
the Da Vinci Project.
Da Vinci Code. It starts off with Dan Brown saying something to the effect in his introduction that everybody loves a good conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And he weaves into that fictional narrative what seem like historical claims.
Right.
And there's this narrative of suspicion that again the church has suppressed certain documents.
Yeah.
That these other gospels that didn't make their way into our Bible, the New Testament canon, they're just as ancient and therefore just as authoritative. If you know just a tad a bit about historical methodology and a little bit of the facts of history, you'll know there's actually a more common reason that those books weren't included, because they were written way too late to have been connected to any sort of eyewitness testimony, and so therefore are not credible for looking at history.
Also, if you take sort of the individual markers that you're supposed to look at to recognize canon, they don't make it on multiple fronts, and one of them being is that they're an outlier teaching from everything else, Old Testament and New Testament, which is important. Now, that doesn't in and of itself make them untrue, but if you connect that to questionable authorship, up to, and even, this figure even have the ability to write what's being attributed to them. Is the authorship even correct? And then you take sort of the dating hundreds of years too late. They're easy to toss out at that point, but you could see how easy it would be to write a whole book where you tried to convince people that, boy, this evil Christian empire has been holding this information. Then you read the books themselves and you're like, this is not just secret. This is weird.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is like, right, the idea that canons are these, the Empower group. I think
patriarchal
people know that that's wrong, right?
Forced it on
because that language of canon, which comes from the Christian scriptures, has made its way into secularism and in any fandom in the universe, right? And people have authorities. It was either written by an author, or it was published by the right publisher, or it wasn't, right? If you're talking about Star Wars, if it wasn't published by Lucasfilm,
very upset that Timothy Zahn stories didn't make it into the Star Wars canon, by the way.
If you're talking about comic books, if it wasn't produced by the right publisher, even if it was the right author, it's not in, right? If an author just goes and writes his own books and doesn't publish it with Marvel, they're not canon, quote, right? And so people care about this kind of stuff. And so to say that Christianity has the same kinds of standards doesn't mean that they were suppressing something. It means that they were being careful and doing some stewardship and making.
And wouldn't you want them to be careful when it's this literal life and death?
Yeah. If you, in short, I think what we're talking about here is, if you don't know a little bit about history, or you don't know the general sort of narrative and so on, it's really hard to avoid being a Gnostic, both in the specific meaning of the term, but also the general meaning of the term, that you fall prey very easily to abstract ideas and systems that have no correspondence to reality, or limited correspondence to reality. That's a point political scientists make. I think there's a French political philosopher whose name escapes me now, but he wrote that there's no more dangerous group of people who do not have a history. That is, they're willing to sever their ties with the past completely and just enter the future in a way that doesn't reflect on how things have happened in the past. They'll make not only mistakes.
Modern progressive society.
Yeah. That when they sever themselves from history, they're severing everything that holds them back from doing perhaps tremendously terrible things. Think of think of the 20th century, the Nazis and the communists, who they weren't anti-history, but they completely rewrote history to justify everything they were doing in the present.
Even from an innovation standpoint, right? Technological, medical, scientific innovations occur because particular people understood human problems. If you stop looking at history and you have no reference for what real human problems and suffering and struggling are, there is no forward to which you can go. There's no make things better, make things easier, make things healthier, or whatever you want the goal to be. And so you're left to sort of make up everything. You have to make up the problems and the solutions, which gets you into very weird territory.
Indeed.
We're so hot on innovation that it's damaging to us.
Well, guys, awesome little episode. Why you should study history. If you have been enjoying the Why You Should series and have suggestions, you can send those via the contact form of the 1517 website. I have gotten several of those, and I think most of the ones I've gotten so far would be best done with some guests. So I'm working on making those lists before we go ahead and record some of those. But if you have ideas, go ahead and send them in for the Why You Should series. And if you would like to support the Thinking Fellows and the Podcast Network in 1517, you can go to 1517.org/donate. And if you are unable or are not ready to financially support the shows yet, you can help us out by reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts. Thank you very much. We will catch you next week. Bye.